Hey guys, tonight, we're peeling back the royal curtain carefully with gloves and stepping into the glittering yet absolutely rancid world of Queen Elizabeth I. You imagine pearls, ruffs, majestic gowns, but you're not ready for the smells. You're really not ready. Imagine the scent of heavy white lead makeup melting down a face that hasn't seen soap in weeks. Or a palace hallway so thick with unwashed wigs and rotting teeth that even your dreams might gag a little. Yes, tonight we dive nose first into the personal hygiene of England's Virgin Queen. You probably won't survive this olfactorily speaking, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now in your corner of the world? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit in the dim glow of candlelight, gazing at the image of Elizabeth. Her face pale as snow, lips red like cochineal hair, curled high and stiff like a lion's mane. She's breathtaking, until you lean in closer. That flawless skin, a thick crust of ceruse, a paste made from vinegar and white lead. Yes, lead. You know the stuff that causes tremors, hair loss, and death. And yet it was the Elizabethan beauty standard. You weren't considered properly regal unless your face looked like an alabaster plate and cracked like dried mud. The problem is, Elizabeth wore it constantly. She layered it, reapplied it, even slept in it. No makeup wipes back then. Historians still argue whether she did this to hide pockmarks from smallpox or simply to appear eternally youthful. But either way, her skin underneath. Let's just say you'd rather not see it in natural lighting. Underneath that iconic white facade, her real skin was reportedly scabbed and discolored, irritated from years of toxic beauty rituals. And when you mix in royal stress, poor ventilation, and a wardrobe of 20-pound gowns, you've got a walking, talking, crumbling fresco. One ambassador once noted that up close the Queen looked far older than her portraits suggested. You think, now let's talk about teeth. Elizabeth had a major sweet tooth, partly due to trade with the New World. Sugar was a luxury, and the elite devoured it like status candy. Unfortunately, there was no Colgate in sight. Brushing rare. Toothpaste. Not really a thing. At best, someone might use a cloth dipped in vinegar. At worst, nothing at all. The result, black crumbling teeth and a breath so foul that foreign dignitaries reportedly flinched when she spoke too closely. But here's the kicker, people admired her teeth. Because black teeth meant you were wealthy enough to afford sweets. Imagine decaying molars as the Renaissance version of diamond grills. Her courtiers even tried to imitate the look, some using soot to darken their smiles. Yes, voluntarily. Dental envy in the Tudor age really hit differently. There are whispers that Elizabeth eventually lost many of her teeth, making her speech slurred and her diet mushy. But she compensated with thick layers of rouge and bright gowns. If you can't dazzle with words, dazzle with wardrobe. You shift slightly in your bed, feeling the comfort of modern hygiene. Imagine how different life would be if your beauty products were poisoning you slowly. If your radiant Instagram glow required mercury lead and the occasional slice of raw beef strapped to your face overnight. Yes, that was a thing. Don't worry, we'll get there. In portraits, Elizabeth looks timeless, untouchable. But in real life, her appearance was a careful illusion, held together with powder, perfume, and sheer willpower. And underneath it all, her skin likely ached, her gums bled, and her breath, well, you'd keep a polite distance. As you begin to drift into the rhythm of the Tudor world, just remember that royal beauty came at a cost, and we're only getting started. You're standing in the echoing stone halls of a Tudor palace. You expect to hear harp music or the rustle of silks. Instead, your nose wrinkles something. Ripe is in the air. You glance down one corridor, hoping to spot a golden bathtub fit for a queen. But spoiler, you won't. Elizabeth was ruler of a global empire, was not a fan of baths. Despite her regal image, the Virgin Queen was deeply suspicious of water. Not just river water or murky puddles, all water. The prevailing wisdom of the 16th century said that bathing opened your pores, leaving you vulnerable to disease. Let that sink in. Bathing was considered dangerous. So naturally, Elizabeth avoided it. There's a famous quote often attributed to her: "I have bathed, but twice in my life, once on the occasion of my birth, and once again when I was a child." Historians still argue whether she truly said this or if it was a bit of anti-Tudor slander, but regardless, the sentiment captures the general vibe of the era. Cleanliness was about visible dirt, not invisible germs. If you didn't look dirty, you were fine. But how did she stay clean? You'd be surprised or horrified. Elizabeth used linen shifts as a kind of body filter. She wore them under her gowns and they absorbed sweat and skin oils. Instead of washing herself, she'd change the shift. It's like never showering, but convincing yourself your socks are doing all the work. When Elizabeth did bathe, it was often just a sponge down with warm water and herbs, lavender rose petals, maybe a splash of wine. These were more ritual than sanitation, a little royal aromatherapy rather than a good scrub. And the process was labor-intensive. Heating water, carrying it by hand, preparing the oils, it took an army of servants. So you can bet she wasn't doing that on a weekly basis. She also occasionally used what were called dry baths, which sound fancy, but were basically just being rubbed down with cloths dipped in scented powders. Talcum, crushed herbs, ground flowers, anything to mask the musk. If it sounds like medieval Febreze, that's because it kind of was. And then there were the communal baths. Not royal ones, Elizabeth would never, but public bathhouses were still around, though falling out of favor. Associated more with the working class and often illicit activity, these steamy spaces were slowly closing down, thanks to fears about syphilis and sin. So even if the Queen had wanted a bath, finding a neutral spa day was unlikely. But here's a fun little wrinkle: Elizabeth did own a fancy bathtub. It was described as a luxurious wooden structure, possibly lined with pewter or tin, and stored at her country residence. Yet it was mostly symbolic proof of wealth, not a daily utility. Think of it as a royal treadmill, impressive, expensive, and rarely used. By the late 1500s, European royalty had turned cleanliness into theater. Perfumes, powders, handkerchiefs dipped in vinegar, all meant to imply a kind of spiritual purity, not actual sanitation. The court was all about appearances, and no one embodied that contradiction more than Elizabeth. And yet, this wasn't laziness or ignorance, it was fear. Disease outbreaks were constant. London was frequently on the edge of plague. People genuinely believed that water could transmit illness through the skin. They didn't understand bacteria, but they did notice that bathers often got sick afterward. To them, the logic was airtight. Still, as you lie back and picture the queen stepping into her dressing chamber, you can't help but wonder about the smell. The layers of fabric, the stiff collars, the powdered wigs, all holding on to weeks of sweat and perfume like a sponge. Courtiers would douse themselves in rosewater musk or civet, yes, the glandular goo from a wild cat, to mask body odor. The result, a fragrant fog so thick it might make your eyes water. But this wasn't considered unpleasant. It was fashionable. The funk of court life was a sign of status. Only the rich could afford enough perfume to weaponize their scent. If you had a bath too often, people might mistake you for a baker's apprentice, or worse, a Frenchman. You shift under your blanket, suddenly aware of your clean sheets, your nightly shower, your toothpaste. Imagine being in that Tudor gown for the third day in a row, sweat-soaked linen stuck to your back, no bath in sight. And the queen, she's just dabbed herself with rose water and declared herself ready to meet a Spanish ambassador. Next time someone tells you to act like royalty, maybe remember that royalty didn't always smell like roses. Sometimes they just covered the stink with them. You trail behind Elizabeth, or now not physically, of course, but in your mind's eye as she glides through the halls of Whitehall Palace. Her silks whisper against polished stone. Her collar fans wide like the sunrise. You half expect her to leave behind a trail of glitter and virtue. But what actually lingers in her wake is smell. And oh, what a smell it is. The royal court didn't just reek it, waged a full-blown sensory war against its own stench. This was an age before plumbing, before regular laundering, before the concept of deodorant had so much as entered a dream. The grand halls were packed with sweating nobles, densely layered fabrics, open fires, and chamber pots tucked into corners. The result, a bouquet of damp wool, spoiled food, and unwashed humans trying very hard to pretend otherwise. But Elizabeth's court wasn't resigned to the funk. No, they weaponized fragrance. The Tudor elite were obsessed with perfume, not for allure, but for survival. To exist in court, you had to fight back against the stench, with stronger stench. So what did they use? Everything. Nobles carried pomanders, delicate, often ornate little spheres stuffed with cloves, ambergris myrrh, cinnamon, and dried flowers. These were dangled from belts or held to the nose like medieval gas masks, but stylish. You might see a noble suddenly pause mid-conversation to gently inhale the contents of a silver acorn. Totally normal behavior. Elizabeth herself was no stranger to scent warfare. She loved rose oil lavender sachets and spicy imported blends. Her gloves were perfumed with orris root. Her letters, yes, even her correspondence were sometimes scented. Some historians say this was an extension of her power, a way to leave her mark, not just visually, but olfactorily. You couldn't forget her presence, even after she'd gone, and the courtiers followed suit. Literally. Their clothing was sometimes sewn with small pouches of dried herbs. Some even lined their hats with dried petals or stitched scented wax into their doublets. It was a DIY solution to an unspoken truth everyone smelled, and no one was bathing, so you'd better come armed. Even the furniture played along. Cushions were sprinkled with crushed flowers or infused with vinegar and rosemary. Carpets were perfumed with cedar oil. Tapestries were beaten outdoors, not just to clean them, but to air out the trapped body odors clinging from daily court life. Of course, this wasn't just about pleasant smells, it was also about health. The Tudor belief in bad air or miasma meant that stench was dangerous. If it smelled bad, it was bad. So filling the air with clove-scented mist wasn't just to impress guests, it was an attempt at medicine. Historians still argue whether this obsession with fragrance actually helped keep the plague at bay, or if it just made everyone feel better while doing nothing at all. And then came the nosegays. Literal bouquets people carried with them everywhere. Sometimes pinned to the chest, other times held up to the nose in crowded areas. Think of them like personal air filters made of violets and thyme. Royal physicians recommended certain floral combinations for court appearances and advised courtiers to refresh thy breath with the herbs of God. Sound advice considering toothpaste wasn't exactly reliable. You picture a sea of elegant nobles, each discreetly sniffing a rose-stuffed locket, while Elizabeth holds court with a face painted in powdered lead and a gown scented with crushed pine. There's a surreal beauty to it, a dreamlike pageant of elegance, layered over some serious funk. But the scent games didn't always work. Behind all the perfume, people still sweated. Their clothes absorbed it. Their wigs trapped it. Their chambers soaked it in. You could scent your gloves with frankincense, but if your mattress hadn't been changed in 5 years, well, let's just say the divine aroma had competition. Even Elizabeth's bedchamber, for all its grandeur, couldn't completely escape the reality of human biology. Carpets weren't vacuumed, they were swept and rarely washed. Heavy curtains held on to years of must. And the Queen's elaborate dresses, often reused and reworn without washing. Fabric was precious, and frequent laundering ruined delicate threads. Instead, garments were freshened with spritzes of vinegar and left to air. You glanced down at your modern pajamas, suddenly feeling incredibly fancy. And yet, despite the odor offensive, there was something undeniably magical about it. The court wasn't unaware of its filth, it just rose above it literally and figuratively with scent. To them, cleanliness was not the absence of dirt, but the presence of luxury. If you could drown your stench in ambergris and rose oil, you were doing just fine. So next time you light a candle or spritz some room spray, think of Elizabeth Vauche. Somewhere in her palace, she's passing a window cracked open just enough to let the scent of lavender mingle with the smell of courtiers who haven't bathed since Candlemas. And somehow she still rules like a goddess. Now imagine yourself standing behind the Queen as she prepares for court, her gown towering her collar stiff and her hair. A marvel of engineering and horror. Because beneath those glorious wigs and jeweled headdresses, a writhing, scratching, unwashed reality lice fleas, and even the occasional mouse. Yes, mice. Elizabeth didn't invent the elaborate Tudor hairstyle, but she perfected it. Her signature look, red curls meticulously arranged, puffed and pinned into high arches, was the result of hours of work by her ladies-in-waiting. But those weren't her natural locks. Most of the time they were wigs, and not exactly the breathable, hypoallergenic kind. These wigs were made of real human hair, often collected from maids, or the deceased cleaned only enough to avoid full-on infestation. Once placed upon her royal scalp, they were powdered, perfumed, and pinned into place sometimes for days, even weeks. A perfectly lacquered dome of style and status, and sometimes lice. Because in Elizabethan England, lice weren't shameful, they were inevitable. Everyone had them, even the Queen. The courtiers had them. The clergy had them. You had lice in your clothes, in your eyebrows, in your wigs, and yes, scuttling around in the linen shifts you wore day and night. It was such a daily problem that knit combs made of ivory or bone were considered thoughtful gifts. You might imagine the queen scratching at her head beneath that powdered nest. She wouldn't be alone. Historians still argue whether her wigs were ever cleaned thoroughly or just left out to air. But we do know that pest deterrents were sewn directly into the linings. Sachets of lavender and crushed herbs were supposed to keep the bugs away. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the lice just got a spa day. And while lice were the small stuff, bigger things lurked too. There are records, strange but real, of rodents nesting in wigs or chewing at headgear left unwatched. Mice, ever opportunistic, found comfort in the padding and warmth of hairpieces tossed onto chairs overnight. You try not to imagine it, but there's a real possibility that Elizabeth's towering hair was once someone's makeshift mouse loft, the Queen's solution. More wigs, bigger ones, more powder, more perfume, more pomp. She had over 80 wigs according to some accounts, each suited for a specific mood or political message. Some were flame red to emphasize her Tudor lineage. Others were dark for mourning. But they were all dense, heavy, and alive with the quiet scuttling of Tudor reality. And don't think the men were off the hook. Courtiers followed the same trends, stuffing their doublets with padding and donning curled mustaches waxed into place. Their hats were often lined with fur, and guess what loved fur fleas? It wasn't uncommon for a noble to stop mid-conversation and casually scratch at his collar, hoping no one noticed the parasite parade in his ruff. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting also suffered. They spent hours every day handling wigs, unpinning gowns, brushing out knotted hair that hadn't been washed in weeks. There were no conditioners, no lice treatments, just patience combs and prayers. It said some maids developed permanent sores on their chins from daily brushing of those grand wigs. Others came down with court sickness, a catch-all term that could include anything from nausea caused by perfume overload to flea-borne fever. But the hair wasn't just fashion. It was a message. Elizabeth used her appearance to control her image. The more elaborate the hairstyle, the more invincible she looked. Her enemies might whisper about her rotting teeth or her pocked skin, but her magnificent hair told a different story. I am eternal. I am untouched. I am queen. Even when smallpox scarred her face, Elizabeth leaned harder into the wigs, the makeup, the armor of beauty. She wasn't hiding, she was building a mask the world would never see beneath. And her people adored her for it. You lie in your bed now, your own hair freshly washed and still faintly smelling of shampoo. It's hard to imagine the sensation of a lice comb against your scalp, or the weight of a wig that hasn't breathed since last Sunday. But in Elizabeth's world, that was daily life. A little scratching, a small price to pay for majesty. So the next time you see a portrait of the Queen, with her impossibly elegant red curls spiraling like a divine halo, remember, under that crown, a war was raging. A quiet, itchy, very persistent war. You're at a royal banquet. Now platters of sugar-glazed meats, gilded pies, marzipan molded into mythical beasts, and across the room, Queen Elizabeth smiles. Or at least she tries. Her lips curl back slightly to reveal, well, let's just say it's not exactly a Colgate commercial. Elizabeth's teeth were famously black and rotting by the later years of her reign. But here's the kicker that wasn't a shameful secret, it was fashionable. In a strange twist of Tudor logic, the worse your dental health, the richer you probably were. Why sugar? In the late 16th century, England's growing trade with the New World introduced vast quantities of sugar into the country. It was wildly expensive, which meant only the elite could afford it. Elizabeth, with her penchant for candied violets, sugar-dusted almonds, and sweetened wines, had access to it in abundance. Her love for sweets was legendary. Even her medicine was laced with sugar syrups, lozenges, sugar plums, meant to strengthen the brain. Spoiler, they didn't. So naturally, her teeth suffered. Accounts describe her struggling to chew, speaking with a slight slur, and suffering from bleeding gums. A visiting ambassador once noted that her blackened teeth made understanding her speech somewhat difficult. Ouch. But here's the wild part: members of her court copied her. They rubbed soot on their teeth, or chewed on blackened herbs to give themselves the same look. Having dark, decaying teeth meant you could afford sugar. It was a visible badge of status, like today's designer handbag, except it was slowly killing your gums. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth had any teeth left by the 1590s. Some reports suggest she lost many or most of them. There are even letters hinting that meals had to be prepared specially for her: softened breads, mashed fruits, even meat pulps to accommodate her struggling bite. You're picturing a royal feast, and the queen quietly slurping beef mush from a silver spoon. And dental care, don't even ask. Toothbrushing wasn't standardized. Some folks wiped their teeth with linen cloths dipped in vinegar or wine. A few wealthier households had toothsticks carved from aromatic woods, but even these were more for show than actual cleaning. Elizabeth likely relied on clove oil sage rinses and the occasional painful tug from her court barber surgeon if a tooth got infected. The problem: there were no painkillers as we know them. You had opium, maybe alcohol and grit. If you had a rotten tooth, you could either keep it and suffer or yank it out with a pair of metal tongs. Fun. And it wasn't just the queen. The entire court had sugar fever. Banquets became sugar theater, marzipan sculptures, sugar castles, whole animals encased in caramel shells. One chronicler described a wedding feast where every single dish was sugared. Not just desserts. Fish, vegetables, meat. Sugar was power, and rot came with it. Even children weren't spared. Wealthy families proudly displayed their kids' blackening teeth as proof of privilege. Imagine posing for your formal portrait with molars already falling out, and your parents beaming proudly beside you. It was a badge of status and decay. But let's not forget the breath. With those sugar-rotted teeth came halitosis, chronic, pungent, unavoidable. Mouthwash wasn't a thing, but people tried. There were herbal rinses like thyme-infused vinegar or wine boiled with mint and cinnamon. Some chewed cloves or fennel seeds after meals, but nothing could fully mask the scent of tooth decay. Even Elizabeth, famously image-conscious, couldn't completely hide it. It's said that she avoided close conversation with foreign dignitaries in her later years. Whether out of modesty or because she couldn't stand the embarrassment of her own breath, we'll never know. But her portraits kept smiling, even as behind the painted grin, her real teeth crumbled away. You lie there now, maybe glancing toward your toothbrush on the nightstand, feeling a new kind of gratitude for fluoride. Imagine your own mouth full of sugar-laced sludge, your dentist replaced by a barber with forceps and clove oil, your only defense against nerve pain. Suddenly brushing twice a day doesn't sound so bad, and yet, Elizabeth endured. She ruled fiercely, diplomatically, powerfully rotten teeth and all. Her mouth may have betrayed her, but her words still held the weight of a nation. When she spoke, people listened, though they may have taken a polite step back. It's the middle of the night in the palace, and you're wandering the stone corridors barefoot. Not by choice, of course, but because nature has called. You search for the toilet, but there isn't one. Not a single flush in the entire royal residence. Instead, you head for what some call the privy chamber, or if you're unlucky, a simple corner of a hallway that's been unofficially claimed by generations of desperate nobles. Yes, welcome to the glamorous world of Elizabethan bathroom habits. Let's get this out of the way. There were no modern toilets in Elizabeth I's court. The average person used chamber pots, which were quite literally pots. Porcelain, if you were lucky, metal or wood if you weren't. These were kept in bedrooms under chairs, or even tucked behind tapestries. At court, they were emptied by servants called gong farmers, a title somehow even worse than the job. These poor souls had the Herculean task of collecting waste and carting it away, often by hand. And where did the waste go? Good question. In most cases, it was dumped into cesspits beneath the palace or out windows into moats, streams, or the Thames itself. Forget plumbing, Elizabethan hygiene was a delicate game of hide the filth. And in palaces like Whitehall, where hundreds of courtiers lived and worked, that game got out of control fast. Some parts of the palace reportedly became unofficial latrines. Courtiers unwilling to lose their place in line to speak with the queen would simply relieve themselves behind curtains, down stairwells, or in corners. And since not all chamber pots were emptied regularly, the result was a royal hallway that sometimes reeked like an open sewer. You think scented pomanders were just for style, try survival. Even Elizabeth had to go somewhere. But don't worry, her experience was slightly more elegant. She had access to a close stool, a kind of portable throne with a padded seat, and a hidden chamber pot beneath. It was upholstered, dignified, and emptied by one very privileged servant, the groom of the stool. Now, before you recoil in horror, know this: the groom of the stool was one of the most prestigious positions in the royal household. Chosen from the noble elite, this person had intimate access to the queen and her most private moments. He managed her linens, monitored her health, controlled who could visit the privy chamber, and yes, assisted when she went to the bathroom. Historians still argue whether the groom actually wiped the royal rear records are vague blessedly, but what's clear is that the position was a powerful one. Serving as groom meant trust. It meant influence. It meant you'd better not flinch when things got, well, messy. And Elizabeth wasn't shy about these arrangements. She even rewarded her grooms with lands and political appointments. One Sir John Harrington designed an early flushing toilet, yes, a flushing toilet, which he installed at his own estate and presented to the Queen. She reportedly liked the idea, but never actually had one installed. Why? Maybe it was too loud, or too new, or just too suspiciously French. So the Queen stuck with her close stool, which was emptied regularly, scented with herbs, and kept spotless by a rotating team of attendants. But that was the Queen. The rest of the court wasn't so lucky. You think back to the countless layers of clothing Elizabeth and her nobles wore: corsets, petticoats, hoop skirts. Going to the bathroom wasn't fast. It required help, patience, and often more planning than a dinner party. You didn't just go, you scheduled it. And during public events, people held it, or didn't. There are records of nobles wetting themselves rather than risk stepping out of favor's reach. Some even wore early versions of pads or cloth liners in case of accidents. Court life was brutal, even on the bladder. Imagine being dressed in brocade from neck to floor perfume, clinging to your collar, and the scent of urine slowly rising from the floor beneath your slippers. Not exactly the Disney version of monarchy, is it? And yet, no one blinked. It was just part of life. The scent of power wasn't just rose oil and beeswax. It was also chamber pots, damp stone, and a river of natural fragrance wafting through the velvet drapes. So as you shift under your modern duvet, maybe whisper a thank you to your indoor plumbing, your toilet flushes, your bath runs hot, and no one has to hold a perfumed bouquet while you're doing your business. You awaken in your Tudor-era bedchamber, stone walls, wooden beams, a faint chill in the air, and pull on the same linen shirt you wore yesterday, and the day before that, and possibly last week, too. Welcome to the mystery of the clean shift. In the court of Elizabeth I, washing your body was risky, but changing your linen, that was everything. You see, Elizabethans believed linen shirts called shifts for women or chemises for men actually cleaned you. Not metaphorically, literally. The soft white fabric was considered absorbent enough to pull the filth right off your skin. The logic went, if the linen got dirty, you were now clean. Think of it as medieval blotting paper for your armpits and undercarriage. So instead of scrubbing yourself in water, you'd just swap out your shift and call it a day. Maybe. Eventually. When the mood struck, Elizabeth herself was meticulous about clothing, but even she didn't change shifts daily. Some records suggest she had dozens, some hand-stitched, perfumed, embroidered with gold thread, but she might wear one for several days, especially during travels. Washing clothes was time-consuming and harsh on fabric. Most people, even at court, reused garments until they practically stood on their own. And forget underwear. It wasn't standard. Women wore nothing beneath the shift, except maybe a farthingale, and men just tied up what needed tying. So that clean linen was doing a lot of heavy lifting, but the linen was also status. Pure white was the goal, symbolizing virtue, wealth, and good breeding. The whiter your shift, the more servants you had to bleach, boil, and beat it into shape. If you were poor, your shift was probably grayish stiff and vaguely cabbage-scented. If you were Elizabeth, yours was starched, ironed, scented with rosewater, and changed often enough to appear clean, at least in public. Still, the concept of laundry was a full-blown ordeal. Washing required vats of water heated by hand tubs, lye soap which could burn skin, and hours of labor. Clothes were pounded, scrubbed, rinsed, then laid out on hedges or bushes to dry in the sun. If the weather was bad, well, enjoy your damp socks for another week. And the smell, linen soaked up everything: sweat, perfume, food, body odor, smoke from hearths, dampness from stone walls. There were no closets, so garments hung openly, absorbing every note of palace life. Elizabeth's gowns might have looked pristine in portraits, but up close you'd likely catch a hint of stale lavender battling mildew and mothballs. Now here's where it gets stranger. Some people believed you shouldn't wash your entire body at all. Just your hands, face, and if you were feeling fancy, your feet. But your torso, arms, legs. Let the linen handle that. So it's no surprise that clean became a visual concept. If you looked crisp, smelled floral, and your lace ruff sat properly, then you were clean enough. No one sniffed too closely. And with chamber pots lurking in every corner, remember last section, expectations were appropriately low. Even Elizabeth's bedding followed the clean linen illusion. Her sheets were changed more often than most, but washed sometimes just meant aired out, beaten, and perfumed. Some households boiled their linen weekly, others went months. A queen had options, a maid had fleas. Historians still debate how often Elizabeth changed clothes. Some claim she had a rotating wardrobe so vast that she never wore the same gown twice. Others point to accounts of repeat appearances, perhaps symbolic, perhaps just practical. Fabric was precious. Gowns were investments. Washing them often could destroy them. And then there's the myth of the unwashed noble. Some argue that Elizabethans were far more hygienic than we give credit for, that they wiped down with damp cloths, used herbal rinses, and obsessively maintained their linens. Others point to parasite infestations, festering wounds, and lice colonies as proof that cleanliness was mostly for show. Historians still argue whether the linen ritual was effective self-care or just wishful thinking in cotton form. You lie there now, cozy in your machine-washed t-shirt, and imagine tugging on the same linen shift for the 4th day in a row, knowing it's meant to clean you. You're not sure if it's genius or delusion or maybe a bit of both. One thing's certain in the Tudor court laundry was a performance. You might reek like a goat under your velvet gown, but if your cuffs were white and your shift looked fresh, then you were clean enough to stand beside a queen. Just don't lift your arms. You're back in Elizabeth's inner chambers now, candlelight flickering across embroidered pillows and tables stacked with curious bottles. On one sits a small bowl of crushed rosemary. Beside it, a bowl of leeches. Welcome to the Queen's beauty routine, equal parts spa day battlefield and straight-up medieval horror show. You might picture Elizabeth's iconic image: alabaster skin, bold red lips, a forehead so high it could host a jousting match. But behind the grandeur was a daily war against blemishes, boils, rashes, and wrinkles waged with herbs, bloodletting, and concoctions that would terrify any dermatologist. Start with the most royal of nuisances, pimples. Yes, even queens got them. The Tudor diet didn't help heavy on sugar wine meat and well more sugar. Combine that with layers of makeup, poor airflow, and infrequent bathing, and skin flare-ups were inevitable. Elizabeth's response: face masks made of honey vinegar, crushed pearls, egg whites, and occasionally, brace yourself, mercury. Yes, mercury. Applied directly to the skin to smooth imperfections. It didn't just kill bacteria, it also peeled away layers of your face, and over time it poisoned you. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's increasing fatigue, mood swings, and hair loss were signs of lead and mercury poisoning, or just the toll of ruling a chaotic empire. Probably both. When her skin needed serious help, she turned to the bleeding bowl. Bloodletting wasn't just for fevers, it was used to rebalance the body's humors. Have a spot on your cheek, must be your liver. Better bleed you out. The queen might have used leeches, especially behind closed doors. They were gentler than a blade, but no less horrifying. Picture a pale royal hand resting on a silk pillow while a tiny creature sucks from her wrist to balance her chai. That's not a fantasy, it's a documented practice. And let's not skip over her hairline, shall we? Elizabeth, like many noble women, shaved or plucked the front of her scalp to raise her forehead. A tall brow was a sign of intelligence and grace. Tweezers rare. Most women just yanked the hairs out one by one or used a paste made of vinegar and walnut shells to chemically burn the follicles. It stung, It left rashes. But it was beauty. Even her eyebrows were barely there. Thin, arched, and painted if necessary. Natural brows were peasant brows. The queen would rather draw a noble line in charcoal than appear unkempt. But for all the skin trauma, Elizabeth also dabbled in more peaceful remedies. She adored herbs, rose chamomile, rosemary, myrtle. Her apothecaries mixed tonics for sleep poultices, for swelling balms, for cracked lips. Sometimes she soaked cloths in rose water and laid them over her face. A proto-spa mask, if you will. Other times she inhaled herbal steams meant to clear the pores and sweeten the breath. Of course, nothing cleared the pores quite like sweating under 40 pounds of fabric in a court with no air conditioning. Elizabeth often powdered her face to conceal the shine, but those layers trapped dirt, sweat, and bacteria beneath the leaden mask. After a few days, pimples galore. Some historians believe she may have suffered from adult acne or rosacea. Her later portraits depict smoother skin, but those were flattering commissions, not honest records. In private, she might have been struggling with breakouts, scarring, and dry patches. One courtier described her complexion as graced by powder and yet unrested, which is a very diplomatic way to say yikes, and her solutions were creative. A popular blemish cure at the time included dried dog's dung mixed with vinegar, not confirmed in Elizabeth's regimen, but not outside the realm of possibility. You wonder how many desperate nights led her to try some court physician's fragrant little promise in a bowl, but she persevered. She held audiences, signed treaties, rejected suitors, all while quietly enduring burning cheeks, itching scalp, and the occasional blood-dripping leech. Her appearance was her power, and she guarded it fiercely. You lie still, skin comfortably clean, pores unplagued by crushed walnut or fermented cabbage leaf. It's easy to forget that beauty routines once involved risk, real risk. Elizabeth's rituals were not vanity. They were armor. She couldn't afford to appear tired, blemished, or mortal. So next time you dab on a face mask, light a candle and soak your feet, remember that your royal counterpart once smeared her skin with mercury, summoned leeches, and plucked her hairline to the bone, all to appear untouched. By now, you're probably picturing Elizabeth Thorse as some tragic figure drowning in scented water and scraping her skin raw with walnut paste. But we haven't even reached the most terrifying part of her beauty regime yet. The very thing that made her famous, her makeup. And it's not just a questionable shade of white we're talking about here. It was literal poison, applied daily in full knowledge of its dangers. You shift slightly in your sheets, maybe glance at your skincare products on the nightstand. Imagine swapping those out for a paste made of white lead and vinegar known in Elizabethan times as ceruse. Sounds fancy, but it was essentially a chalky sludge that promised to make your face snow pale, a sign of nobility, wealth, and indoor leisure. In truth, it clogged pores, burned the skin, and slowly poisoned the wearer over years of use. Elizabeth wore it thick. Every portrait you've seen of her porcelain skin, flawless and blank, that was ceruse. Beneath it, historians believe her real skin may have been pitted, scarred, and inflamed from years of chemical assault. But the illusion had to be preserved. She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, semi-divine, untouched by mortality or weakness. You might wonder, didn't anyone tell her to stop? Oh, they did. Physicians of the time warned against the use of lead-based products. But appearance was power. And power to Elizabeth was more than politics, it was performance. Her face was her throne, and she didn't stop at the ceruse. To get that pop of red on her cheeks and lips, she turned to vermilion, a pigment made from powdered cinnabar, which is unfortunately mercury sulfide. Yes, more mercury. Add that to the lead and her makeup was basically a daily death cocktail. And the removal, oh, it gets worse. Taking this stuff off wasn't a gentle wipe with micellar water. It required raw wool cloth, vinegar, pumice stones, or egg whites beaten into a froth and used to lift the poison. Most of it didn't come off. Layer after layer built up over days and weeks. Elizabeth didn't simply wear makeup, she lived beneath it. Historians still argue whether her later life reclusiveness, avoiding mirrors, banning portraits, retreating from public, was due to visible facial damage from ceruse. Some think her anxiety and paranoia in old age were symptoms of lead and mercury poisoning. Others suggest she was simply aging under the impossible pressure of eternal youth. Whatever the cause, her relationship with her appearance became increasingly intense. By the 1590s, her courtiers weren't even allowed to mention her age. Mirrors were removed from her chambers. Her closest ladies-in-waiting had to apply her makeup behind curtains, shielding the queen from her own reflection. All to preserve an image that ironically may have been killing her softly. Still, the court followed suit. What Elizabeth did, everyone else copied. Noble women smeared ceruse on their faces and used Spirit of Saturn, another mercury-based lotion, for skin clarity. They powdered their wigs, outlined their eyes with coal dust, and dabbed their lips with cochineal crushed beetles imported from the Americas. Of course, men weren't immune either. Courtiers powdered their faces to match the queen, and some wore subtle cosmetics to stay fashionable. The line between elegance and decay was razor thin, smelling faintly of vinegar and wearing literal toxins on your face. That was refinement. And behind all this, a society terrified of aging, imperfection, and weakness. Elizabeth's beauty regime was a kind of magic spell, one that required constant maintenance, denial, and suffering. Every morning she transformed herself into something divine. Every night she quietly deteriorated beneath it all. You might feel a shiver now, not from the fan whirring in your room, but from the idea of a woman scraping layers of lead from her cheeks, staring into candlelight, knowing that her glow came at a cost, knowing that her power was quite literally poisoned. You won't look at a white-faced Elizabethan portrait the same way again. Behind every smooth cheek is a story of cracked skin pain and a stubborn refusal to give in to time. So next time someone tells you beauty is pain, just raise a brow and say, "Yeah, but at least my moisturizer doesn't contain mercury." Now you've endured the baths that never came, the lead-laced foundation, and the rat-infested wigs. But trust me, your nose still isn't safe. Because if there's one thing the Elizabethan court was known for, other than ruthless politics and tight corsets, it was the stench. And not just any stench, a bouquet of body odor, rotting meat, and open sewage all mingling under those intricate wooden ceilings. But don't worry, they had a plan. Enter the Nosegay. Imagine you're a courtier gliding through Hampton Court. In your brocade and lace your teeth rotting gently beneath your powdered grin. You clutch a small bunch of herbs and flowers, lavender, rosemary, maybe a few marigolds tied up in a pretty ribbon. It's your constant companion, and not because you're sentimental. No, it's a defensive weapon. Your one hope of surviving the nasal assault that is everyday Tudor life. The Nosegay, sometimes called a posy, wasn't a fashion statement. It was the Elizabethan version of a gas mask. People walked around holding these little bundles to their faces, pretending to admire the sweet scent, when really they were fending off the sour reek of humanity in close quarters. It wasn't just the people who stank. Animals wandered palace halls. Waste bins overflowed. The Thames was a sluggish soup of refuse and dead things. Summer heat only made it worse. And inside the great halls, hundreds of sweating courtiers, many of whom hadn't changed their underclothes in weeks, gathered for hours-long banquets without ventilation. You lift your blanket slightly instinctively, testing the air in your own room. Safe. For now. But let's get back to Elizabeth. Her Majesty, of course, had her own ways of keeping the smell at bay. She surrounded herself with sweet-smelling herbs. Her chambers were strewn with strewing herbs like mint and lavender scattered across the floor to give the illusion of freshness. Every step released a faint perfume. It was charming in theory. In practice, it was a desperate move against rot. Some wealthier courtiers carried pomanders, small perforated metal balls filled with dried spices and soaked cloth. You could hang them from your belt or necklace, or just clutch one tightly while trying not to gag during an audience with a particularly ripe nobleman. But perhaps the most telling sign of olfactory warfare came from a small item known as the scented glove. Elizabeth herself was a fan. These gloves were soaked in scented oils and worn more for aroma than warmth. One popular mixture involved rosewater civet, yes, the glandular excretion from a wild cat, and ambergris, a waxy substance regurgitated by sperm whales. Fancy, yes. Repulsive, also yes. And then there were the plague masks. A few decades after Elizabeth's reign, physicians donned beak-like masks stuffed with herbs and vinegar-soaked sponges to ward off bad air, which they believed caused disease. That idea wasn't new. In Elizabeth's time, miasma theory reigned supreme. People believed that foul odors literally carried illness through the air. So naturally, keeping a posy by your nose wasn't just about comfort. It was a survival tactic. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth's devotion to herbal scents was based on actual medical advice or courtly affectation. Some say it was part of her image, fresh, untouched, clean, in a world that very much wasn't. Others believe her physicians genuinely thought lavender could prevent plague. And still, none of this quite worked. At court gatherings, overpowering perfume clashed with human funk. The smell of rich meat dishes turned sour when mingled with the BO of sweaty nobles. And the kitchens, oh the kitchens. Meat stored improperly, spices masking decay, rodents nibbling at the edges of every feast. Hampton Court may have sparkled on the outside, but the nose knew the truth. There's even a tale of foreign ambassadors arriving only to be stunned by the smell of English royalty. Some recorded their observations in letters gently noting the earthy odors of court life. You know it's bad when someone from 16th century Spain, no stranger to its own funk, describes your palace as overwhelming. And yet through all this, Elizabeth remained poised. Fragrant gloves, herbal sachets, pomanders at her wrist, she kept the illusion of freshness. But it must have taken a toll. Think about the mental effort of managing every whiff, every scented layer, knowing that just beneath the perfume was a truth far less regal. You might laugh, but today's obsession with clean beauty-scented candles and essential oils isn't so far removed. We're still fighting our own little wars against smell, just with better plumbing. So next time you light a lavender candle or spray your linen mist, remember? You're part of a long, desperate tradition of humans trying to outwit their own body odor. Only difference is you've got showers. Elizabeth. She had a posy and a prayer. So far, you've learned that Elizabethan beauty was less spa day and more chemical warfare. But now let's descend into the dark heart of it all, the one part of the Queen's body that inspired both awe and horror in equal measure, her hair. Or more accurately, her wigs. You shift on your pillow again, picturing the elegant copper-red ringlets you've seen in her portraits. Regal, voluminous, flawlessly curled. But don't be fooled by the time Elizabeth was in her 30s. Her natural hair was already falling out, likely from stress illness and lead-based makeup. By her 40s, she was almost certainly bald, and so began the age of the false crown. She wore elaborate perukes, handcrafted wigs made from real human hair, animal hair, or even threads woven with fine wire to support impossible shapes. Some were flaming red to mimic her youthful look. Others were shockingly intricate, towering up to a foot tall, coiled and frizzed into tightly controlled curls, festooned with pearls, lace, or tiny jeweled pins. Each one was more than fashion, it was armor. Wigs weren't unique to Elizabeth, of course, but she turned them into a symbol of divine sovereignty. Her crown didn't just sit atop her head, it was her hair. There are accounts that she owned over 80 different wigs, each carefully stored and maintained by a select team of attendants. Now imagine the process. Each morning, Elizabeth would sit silently while her ladies carefully scraped off the previous month's makeup, massaged a concoction of oils into her raw scalp, and then fitted her chosen wig for the day. They were pinned, stitched, and sometimes glued into place. Adjusting a royal peruke wasn't a casual affair. It was an engineering challenge. But what made this even more haunting was the source of the wigs themselves. In most cases, they were made from hair taken from the poor, particularly young women and children. Some of it was sold voluntarily in desperate exchange for bread or coin. Other times, it was stolen from the recently dead. There are records from the 16th century describing black market operations where bodies were robbed just for their hair, bundled and sold to wig makers. The richer your client, the higher the price for fresh hair. So yes, it's entirely possible that the golden curls you see in Elizabeth's portraits came from a peasant girl who died of plague. Think about that next time you scroll through a wig ad online. The maintenance was nightmarish too. Wigs had to be boiled, combed, soaked in herbs, or dusted with powders to mask the inevitable stench. Lice were everywhere, which led to a secondary market in wig scratchers, thin metal rakes people used to scrape at their scalps under the hairpieces. And it wasn't just about looks. For Elizabeth, wigs became a symbolic mask. With each passing year, her health declined. She lost teeth weight and color, but her wigs remained pristine. The people saw the queen, not the woman behind her. There's a chilling account from 1603, just weeks before her death. Elizabeth refused to lie down. She stood upright in her chambers for hours, nearly unmoving, dressed in a white gown, her wig freshly curled. When her advisors begged her to rest, she whispered, "I will have no man see me weak." It's believed she died still standing, or at least was found so. Her face powdered, her wig fixed in place. You lie still now, and for a moment you understand the weight of that hair. Not just the physical discomfort, but the psychological pressure of it. Imagine waking up each day knowing that your real face, your real hair, your real skin could never be seen. That your entire image was manufactured, layered, and staged. Elizabeth wasn't just performing royalty. She was performing perfection, and the cost of that illusion was immense. Today we celebrate her as iconic immortal, an untouchable figure carved into history. But in those final years, under the wigs and rouge and ruffles, she was someone else entirely. Fragile, human, desperate to hold on. And maybe you see a bit of that still today, don't you? When filters smooth faces into porcelain. When influencers pile on contour like war paint. When celebrities age backwards on camera. The tools may be new, but the game hasn't changed. So the next time you pull on a hat or run your fingers through your hair, spare a thought for Gloriana. Beneath her crown of flame, there was only scalp and sorrow. By now you know Queen Elizabeth's skin was slowly poisoned. Her teeth fell out. Her wigs came from the heads of the dead, and she lived in a world that stank of sewage and dying flesh. But what about her diet? You're imagining golden goblets, roast pheasants, tarts with glistening fruit tables, groaning under exotic spice-laced delicacies, right? Well, sort of. Yes, the Tudor elite ate like kings, but in a way that would make your modern gut churn. And Elizabeth, being queen, indulged in the best of it. The trouble is, best in the 16th century is a very relative term. Start with meat. Elizabeth was obsessed with it. Pork, beef, venison, mutton, if it walked, it could be roasted. And roast they did. Spit-turning fires blazed constantly in the palace kitchens. Her favorite meat was said to be boar-rich and gamey. She enjoyed whole birds served with their feathers artfully reattached after cooking. At banquets, the nobility would tear into dishes like swan pie or peacock, stuffed with herbs and redressed in its own iridescent skin. But here's the thing, no refrigeration. So much of the meat was aged to the point of near putrefaction, then masked with heavy spices. Cloves, cinnamon, ginger used not for flavor, but to hide rot. Sugar helped too, and Elizabeth had a dangerous love for sugar. She drank sweetened wine sucked on candied violets, and devoured marchpane, a kind of dense almond sugar cake with alarming regularity. Her kitchens crafted entire edible sculptures, sugar castles, sugar dragons, sugar roses. It wasn't just dessert, it was political theater. Sugar showed wealth. The more she ate, the more powerful she appeared, and her teeth paid the price. Black, cracked, and falling out by middle age, her dental condition was no secret. In fact, there are reports of foreign ambassadors having trouble understanding her speech through her toothless mouth. She tried to mask it by stuffing cloth into her cheeks to plump her face. Even her portraits began to subtly shift, showing her in poses that covered her mouth or emphasized her eyes instead. Vegetables. Unfashionable. Considered peasant food. Most of the elite barely touched them, believing raw greens caused illness. Fruit was eaten sparingly and usually cooked. Water was avoided entirely, thought to spread disease. Instead, they drank ale, wine, or small beer even for breakfast. Children, too. Meals were long, elaborate affairs, sometimes lasting 5 or 6 hours. Elizabeth herself often stood for much of it, observing more than indulging, especially in her later years. She ate off pewter or silver using utensils coated in lead-based glazes, of course. Lead, again, always lead. But don't think she was unbothered. The queen was deeply paranoid about poisoning. Every dish she ate was tested first by a designated taster. Her silverware was polished obsessively. Her wine, imported aged spiced, was stored in glass flagons rare for the time to reduce contamination risk. Glass at least didn't kill you. Not directly. Despite this, by her 60s, Elizabeth's body was ravaged. Chronic indigestion, swelling in her legs, toothaches that made her refuse food. And still she persisted. sat through state dinners, raised goblets, toasted ambassadors, nibbled sugared almonds with what teeth remained. One diplomat described seeing her in her final year. She lifted her cup to her lips but did not drink. Her hand trembled and the room was still. What's remarkable is how little we see of this in official records. Her letters remain sharp, witty regale. Her speeches, fireworks of charisma. But behind the curtain, a woman whose very body was collapsing under the diet of queenship. She was quite literally rotting from the inside out and still expected to perform majesty. You might think about your own dinner now. Maybe some rice or soup or a protein bar. It's clean, simple, balanced. And maybe that feels dull, but Elizabeth would have traded her feast of flamingo tongue and candied swan for it in a heartbeat, if only to save her teeth, or her stomach, or her life. So the next time you're craving sugar or skipping vegetables, remember the Virgin Queen didn't know about vitamins, but she knew pain. And all that pageantry, the goblets, the boar, the golden sugar towers, they didn't make her immortal. They made her sick. So far, we've peeled back the gilded layers of Elizabeth I's body, her decaying teeth, poisoned skin, rotting diet, and wigs like war masks. But now let's enter the most private, most taboo part of her legend. Her virginity. You've heard it. Everyone has. The Virgin Queen. A monarch who never married, never bore children, never let a man claim her body. But what if I told you that behind that title lies a story of calculated myth-making bodily scrutiny and lifelong surveillance of a woman's most intimate anatomy? Let's begin with the brutal truth. In the 16th century, a woman's power was rooted in her marriage or her chastity. There was no middle ground. If a woman ruled without marrying, people whispered. If she did marry, she became her husband's property. Elizabeth knew this. She knew that to stay unmarried was to dance on a razor's edge. One misstep and her entire kingdom could turn on her. So she weaponized virginity. She declared herself wedded to England. She cast herself as a sacred, untouchable figure, a living icon of purity. Not a woman, but a symbol, a goddess. Poets compared her to Astrea, the Virgin of Justice, or to Diana, the huntress, untouched by men. But the question remained, was it true? Historians have debated this for centuries. And while there's no proof of sexual relationships, there are certainly rumors, especially about one man, Robert Dudley. He was her childhood friend, her closest confidant, her master of the horse. He was handsome, clever, and always there. They shared private chambers. He had unsupervised access to her bedchamber. Ambassadors wrote home claiming the Queen was in love and that it could not be hidden. But here's where it gets even more twisted. Elizabeth's body was not hers. It was the property of the crown, and that meant it was policed. Foreign suitors demanded confirmation she was intact. There are references to court physicians and noblewomen examining her, inspecting her health, and possibly her virginity, though records are vague, veiled in euphemism. One ambassador in 1559 confidently reported, "Her maidenhead is yet whole." Let that sink in. At around 25 years old, Elizabeth may have had to prove to a panel of advisors that her hymen remained untouched. And if that sounds like a horrifying invasion, remember this was the norm for queens and princesses. Their wombs were national property. Elizabeth, however, flipped the script. She didn't just comply, she embraced the role, reinvented it, weaponized it. The Virgin Queen became more than a personal choice. It became policy. By not marrying, she avoided foreign entanglements. She couldn't be controlled by a husband. She played kings of France, Spain, and Sweden against each other, dangling herself as a potential bride, but never sealing the deal. And every time she didn't marry, she grew more powerful. But that didn't mean people stopped watching her body. In her 40s, people began whispering that menopause had struck. In her 50s, rumors of hidden lovers still swirled. Every mole, every illness, every absence from court was interpreted as potential pregnancy. Even into her final years, gossip suggested she had secret children hidden away. Impossible, of course, but the need to decode her body never stopped. And imagine what that meant for her. No privacy, no softness, no romantic partnership she could claim publicly. Any closeness, like with Dudley, or later the younger and more dangerous Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was viewed as political threat. One famous incident reveals everything. Essex once burst into her bedchamber unannounced while she was in her dressing gown, no wig, no makeup, no jewels. She was furious, not because he had seen her, but because he had seen the truth, the woman beneath the mask. And that was her deepest secret. Her real body. It was not supposed to exist. The public knew only Gloriana painted robed eternal. The moment someone glimpsed the aging woman beneath it shattered the illusion, so she stayed celibate, or claimed to. Even as her hair thinned, her skin cracked, her body ached, she held the line. In her mind, perhaps she believed the myth, or maybe she simply knew it was the only way to survive. Because the moment she became just a woman, someone's wife, someone's mother, she stopped being a queen. So tonight, as you lie in the dark, think about that title, the Virgin Queen. It wasn't about innocence. It was about control. It was armor. It was prison. And she wore it for 45 years. By now, you've glimpsed what lies beneath the ruff and the rouge. But to truly understand the brutal reality of sex power and the female body in Tudor England, we must return one last time to the public stage. Because Elizabeth's body, no matter how cleverly concealed, wasn't allowed to rest. Not even as she aged. It had to perform. Always, even as it deteriorated. In her final decade, the queen became a kind of living ghost, a specter draped in silk and symbolism. Courtiers whispered that her fingers had grown so gnarled she could barely sign her own name, that her back was bent, her hands trembled, her legs swelled so badly she had to be carried in a litter. Her wigs sat heavy on her thinning scalp. She wore gloves at all times, not just for elegance, but to hide the liver spots. And still she stood, she danced. Yes, even in her 60s, she danced before ambassadors. To show her vitality, one wrote. It wasn't for joy, it was to prove she was still powerful, still fertile with leadership, still England itself. Because in Tudor England, the body was the symbol of the realm. If Elizabeth looked weak, England looked weak. If she aged visibly, England looked vulnerable. So she painted herself harder, whitened her face more aggressively, tightened her corsets until her ribs ached, and avoided mirrors. One lady-in-waiting noted that the queen had all the reflective surfaces removed from her rooms. She could not bear to look upon time, and she was running out of time. By 1602, her health began to collapse entirely. She stopped eating. She barely slept. She refused to change clothes, wearing the same gown for days, then weeks. She sat silently for hours, motionless, eyes wide. Some thought she was mourning the execution of Essex. Others said she was preparing for death. She wouldn't go to bed because to go to bed meant not getting up again. Eventually, she could no longer stand. They laid her on cushions on the floor, because she refused a deathbed. Her doctors came. Her counsel came. She would not speak, just stared. And in those last days, the body that had ruled an empire unraveled completely. Her hair, once red, was now gray and brittle. Her gums bled. Her limbs were thin, her belly distended. She may have had pneumonia or cancer or sepsis, we'll never know. All we know is that the mask at last slipped, and when she died in the early hours of March 24th, 1603, the silence was thunderous. Courtiers wept. Church bells rang. But her body, so heavily mythologized, politicized, surveilled, sanctified, was finally just flesh again. And even then, she wasn't allowed peace. You see, royal corpses weren't just buried. They were displayed. Her body was embalmed, dressed in her finest robes. A wax mask, painted to resemble her face, placed atop her real one. She was paraded through London in a lead-lined coffin drawn by white horses beneath a black velvet canopy. Crowds stood in silence, not cheering, not wailing, just stunned, because for 45 years Elizabeth's body had been England. Now it was a husk. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, but even there, her tomb told the myth, not the truth. Virginis Elizabetha, Elizabeth the Virgin, etched in marble, the lie made permanent. And yet, was it a lie? Perhaps not. Because the truth is, Elizabeth's virginity wasn't about sex. It was about sovereignty. She chose to define her body not by men or marriage or motherhood, but by majesty. And in doing so, she escaped the fate of every other woman around her. No husband to betray her, no childbirth to kill her, no child to inherit and erase her. Her body had suffered, yes, but her will had endured. And in a time when sex was currency, when women's bodies were used, bought, violated, and discarded, Elizabeth did the impossible. She used her body to rule the world and let no one touch it. The final image of Elizabeth II is one of grandeur, her painted face staring out from portraits in stately halls, her name echoing in centuries of textbooks. But if you were there, standing in the musty hush of her royal chambers, late in her reign, you'd see something far more human, far more fragile. She was by then a queen held together by pins and powder. The smell in her rooms was no longer masked by rose oil or incense. You'd catch sour notes of infection, decay, sweat trapped beneath thick velvet. Her teeth were almost entirely gone. Her breath, a mix of herbs and rot. A single cough could silence a room. But her attendants still bowed, still curtsied, still whispered Gloriana. Because no one dared confront what they saw, that the most powerful woman in Europe was slipping into ruin. Elizabeth's refusal to name a successor, perhaps her most stubborn and fatal choice, was tied to this same obsession with control. Naming an heir meant acknowledging her end, and she'd spent her whole reign resisting that. Just as she'd resisted being defined by her gender, her body, or anyone else's expectations. So she waited, and faded, and vanished finally in the early morning dark. And England didn't fall apart, but something shifted. When James VI of Scotland was declared king, and the Tudor line ended, people began to whisper truths they hadn't dared before. That the Queen had grown strange, that her skin had cracked beneath the ceruse, that rats were found in her walls, that courtiers had seen her whispering to shadows, and that in the end she died afraid. But perhaps not. Perhaps she was simply tired. After all, she had carried a realm in her spine and endured alone. No one alive could remember England without her. And while the personal hygiene of Elizabeth I might horrify you, it also reminds you this woman was human. She bled. She hurt. She smelled like the rest of us. Yet somehow she reigned like a god, and her death didn't erase her myth. It sealed it. Because in the centuries since, we've kept polishing the mask, retouching her portraits, romanticizing her reign, calling her the Virgin Queen like it's a divine title. But under the varnish, the cracks remain. And now you know what she hid. You've wandered through her dirty chambers, peeked into her basins and linens, watched as her skin peeled and her teeth blackened. You've witnessed the artifice, the cost, and the stunning, stubborn power of a woman who defied everything history expected of her. And maybe, just maybe, you're leaving tonight with a little more respect for the guts it took to be Gloriana. So we'll end here with Elizabeth at last at rest. The perfumes are gone. The courtiers have scattered. The velvet hangs still. And beneath stone and legend lies a woman who made herself a myth. One powdered day at a time. Wind down 300 words. Now breathe in, slowly. Let your chest rise, then fall. The echoes of Elizabeth's court fade like the hush of silk on stone floors. The sour scent of the Tudor world dissolves into distant memory. You're no longer standing beside the Queen's deathbed, or caught in the drafty chill of a palace that smelled more like livestock than lilies. You're here in your room in your own time, and everything's quieter now. It's strange, isn't it, to know that beneath all that ceremony and gold and grandeur was just a woman. Not unlike anyone else, not unlike you. As your eyes start to feel heavier, let yourself remember that history isn't just crowns and wars and names in marble. Sometimes it's what people were too embarrassed to write down. The itching, the aching, the awkward, smelly human parts. And still they kept going. So whatever you're facing tonight, whether it's stress or tiredness or just that weird sound your radiator keeps making, take heart. You've just spent the last little while in the presence of a queen who ruled an empire while bleeding through layers of brocade, battling infections, and brushing her teeth with honey and soot. If she could handle that, you can handle tomorrow. Now dim your thoughts, let them soften. Let the quiet settle in. You've earned your rest. Good night, Gloriana. Good night, listener. End of script. Sweet dreams.